Welcome back. Today I'm going to explain the movie called The Proposal from 2009. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and if you are new, please subscribe to the channel and press the bell icon. In the opening scene, we see Margaret Tate get through her morning routine. Margaret Tate is a Canadian executive editor-in-chief of a New York book publishing company. Her assistant Andrew Paxton, after waking up late, hurriedly gets ready, gets coffee for his boss, and sprints to work. When he gets there, he accidentally spilled her coffee, ruining a nice shirt he had on. Margaret, while coming into work that morning, is on the phone with Frank, one of her favorite writers. Margaret enters her office and her daunting and pushy personality, disliked by most of her employees, gets them all on their toes. Andrew, who had traded expensive tickets with a coworker to get into a new outfit, greets her while giving her a cup of coffee. She tells him to get a hold of PR as Frank would be doing an interview with Oprah. Andrew gives a sarcastic comment. Before he leaves, Margaret finds a lady's name with her number written on her cup of coffee, which she asks Andrew about. Andrew explains that it was originally his cup, but her cup spilled, so that's why she's drinking his. Margaret asks if it's a coincidence they both drink the same kind of coffee, and he replies that it must be, since he couldn't possibly think of drinking the same coffee as she does, just in case her cup spills. Margaret goes to see Bob, and she tells him he's fired. She wanted him to get Frank to do Oprah, but Bob shied away and refused to call Frank. Bob then storms out of his office, abusing and slandering Margaret. He tells her she feels threatened by him. Margaret responds to him that she's firing him because of his incompetence, and that she would get him out of the building with an armed escort and have it filmed and uploaded to YouTube if he should continue making trouble. In the next scene, Margaret learns from her superior, Chairman Brendan, that her visa renewal application has been denied due to a visa term violation, and she faces deportation back to Canada for at least a year. Bergen tells her operations would be handed over to Bob while she's gone. Not wanting to lose her position to Bob, who she just fired, and her life in New York, she decides to tell her superiors that she would be marrying her much abused assistant, Andrew. A confused Andrew, stuck in an awkward situation, just nods and agrees to everything his boss says. Brendan advised they both make it legal soon. Back at her office, Andrew asks that she explains what is going on. She reminds Andrew that if she is deported, the work he put in as her assistant would be lost, which will set back his dream to become an editor. U.S. immigration agent Mr. Gilbertson informs them that he suspects they are committing fraud to avoid Margaret's deportation. Gilbertson tells them that they will be asked questions about each other separately. If their answers do not match, Margaret will be deported back to Canada permanently, and Andrew will be convicted of a felony punishable by a $250,000 fine and 5 years in prison. Andrew expresses that they are just two people who weren't supposed to fall in love but did. Mr. Gilbertson asks if their parents are aware of their secret love. Margaret says her parents were dead, but they would be telling Andrew's parents at the weekend when they visit for Gammy's 90th. Mr. Gilbertson asks where Andrew's parents were located. He replies, Sitka, Alaska. Andrew insists that Margaret makes him an editor after their marriage and publishes the book he has been recommending to her. Margaret is forced to agree. The couple travels to Sitka, Alaska, Andrew's hometown, to meet his family. Margaret faces a tough time through the journey, and Andrew is warmly greeted by his mom and grandma. Margaret meets Andrew's mother Grace and grandmother Annie, who they usually call Gammy. During the trip back to the family home, Margaret notices that nearly every shop in town carries the name Paxton, and learns that Andrew's family is in fact very wealthy. Grace tells Margaret that they had their hotel reservations cancelled and they would be at the family home all through their trip. When they arrived, Margaret is shocked to see the home Andrew grew up in. Grace and Annie had set up a welcome home party, inviting 50 of their closest family and neighbors. During the party, Margaret reinforces how important it is that everyone thinks they are in love. Soon, Andrew confronts his father Joe, who is angry about Andrew dating the boss he has so long disliked and believes he is using her to get ahead in his career. After their argument, Andrew announces the engagement to everyone. While Margaret was questioning Andrew's timing for announcing their engagement, Gertrude, Andrew's ex-girlfriend, comes over to greet Andrew, who's pretty excited to see her. Margaret also meets Gertrude. At the party, when everyone asked about the proposal, they go back and forth formulating the story of how Andrew proposed to Margaret. Andrew and Margaret were both asked to kiss each other. After the kiss, they were both taken to the room they would sleep in for the night. The next day, Joe apologizes to Andrew for his rude first impression, saying that the family had no idea they were dating. Joe wants Andrew back in Alaska to take control of the family empire, cause he has plans to retire. Andrew tells his dad he wished he had another child, one that would take over the family business because what he does in New York makes him happy. Meanwhile, Grace and Annie take Margaret to a local bar as part of her bachelorette party to watch a strip dance by locally famous but over-the-hill exotic dancer Ramon. Stepping away from the show, Margaret learns from Gertrude that Andrew wanted to become an editor and make his own life and that Andrew had proposed to Gertrude. However, Gertrude refused because she did not want to leave Sitka for New York. When they get back from the bar, they see Andrew using a hammer to dismantle a wooden canoe. Then Margaret learns of the conflict between Andrew and his father, Joe. Andrew comes into their room and is preparing to take a shower, then Margaret runs out of the bathroom to get a towel. They bump into each other, and Andrew falls to the floor with Margaret on top of him. They both get into a heated argument. That night, Andrew teases Margaret about what had happened earlier, and she claims she does not wish to speak about it. Margaret asks Andrew about his relationship with his father, but Andrew refuses to talk. Instead, Margaret opens up to Andrew about her past. Next, Andrew compliments Margaret, telling her she is a very beautiful woman, which makes her smile. The next morning, Andrew's family does everything to convince them to get married while they are still in Sitka. When they leave the room, Andrew expresses his fears to Margaret about his family finding out their affair was only set up for business reasons. Margaret tells him it's going to be fine, and they won't remain married for too long. She rubs his shoulders, and this makes Andrew become calm. She serves him breakfast, and jokes about how she wishes to learn to cook because she needs to keep her man happy so he doesn't go after another woman. She leaves after saying this, getting on a bike and riding into the woods. Margaret starts hearing strange sounds, coming from within the woods. When Margaret checks out what is happening, she finds Gammy dressed in the woods performing what seemed like a ritual. Annie urges her to come and see how she gives thanks to Mother Earth. Margaret is forced to join her, and soon they start getting into something different. When Andrew finds them, he and Margaret both leave and take a boat ride to the city. Margaret once again runs into Ramon and is creeped out by him. Andrew takes Margaret to the cafe, then he sees Gertrude and goes to meet her. Margaret sees them talking together and later she asks Andrew if it was nice to see Gertrude today. Andrew answers, "Yeah, definitely, it's been a long time." Annie and Grace steal Margaret away once more. They get her into Annie's grandma's bridal dress, which looked nice but still needed adjustments. Margaret is reluctant to accept the gifts Andrew's family is bestowing on her. Margaret realizes how close and real Andrew's family is, and this moves her deeply, especially because of the deception. She gets on Andrew's boat and speeds away with him. She admits she has been alone since she was 16 years old after her parents died, and had forgotten what it felt like to have a family. She lets go of the helm and stumbles to the back of the boat. Andrew takes control of the boat and makes a sharp turn to avoid hitting a buoy, and Margaret falls out of the boat. Andrew quickly turns the boat around and saves her because she cannot swim. After bringing her out of the water, Andrew helps her get warm. Meanwhile, a suspicious Gilbertson has turned up in Sitka ready to charge Andrew with fraud. Gilbertson and Joe have co-conspired a deal to keep Andrew from going to jail, on the condition he reveals his entire engagement as a fraud. Andrew reinforces that he and Margaret have been dating for 6 months prior to the engagement. At the wedding, a dazzling-looking Margaret walks down the aisle accompanied by Gammy. Ramon promptly starts the ceremony, but Margaret stops the ceremony by confessing the truth to the audience and Gilbertson. She tells them she forced Andrew to marry her by threatening his carrier, to prevent her deportation. She tells them she regrets her decision, realizing how wonderful they are. Margaret returns to the Paxton home to pack her things. Andrew rushes to their room only to find Margaret has already left, leaving his book manuscript with a note of praise and a promise to publish it. Gertrude attempts to comfort Andrew and asks if he is going to go after her. Gilbertson informs her she has 24 hours to leave for Canada. As he rushes out to find Margaret, another argument arises between him and Joe. Annie suddenly shows symptoms of a heart attack, causing her and the family to be airlifted to the hospital, and she convinces them to reconcile before she passes away. After she succeeds in getting things moving again, she admits to faking the heart attack as it was the only means to get their attention. And tells the pilot to head to the airport in hopes of catching up to Margaret. When he arrived, Margaret was already on her way back to New York. Andrew's family realizes he really loves Margaret. He returns to New York and tells Margaret he loves her in front of the entire office staff. After they kiss, they go to Gilbertson and inform him that they are again engaged, but for real this time. Gilbertson questions Andrew's family and friends, which proves it. The movie ends here, and you're welcome to share your thoughts on this movie in the comment section below. Make sure to subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this, and hit the like button to help us out. I'll see you in the next video. Stay well, thanks. Welcome back to the Movie Buff. Today I'm going to recap the comedy and romance movie titled Pretty Woman. Spoilers ahead, watch out, and take care. A man called Edward Louise is on the phone with his girlfriend Jessica at a party. She tells him she is speaking more to his secretary than to himself, and that she's breaking up with him. While leaving, he meets a woman who's newlywed asking her if she spoke more to his secretary than him when they were dating, and she replies his secretary was one of her bridesmaids. Outside, Edward asks his lawyer Philip to borrow his car. Philip gets worried his car would get damaged since Edward is a bad driver but reluctantly agrees. That evening, a woman called Vivian is waking up and starts preparing to go out. As she is finished and about to leave, she sees her landlord on the stairwell and decides to go back into the apartment. She goes to pick out money for rent but only sees a little money left and instead leaves through the window. She goes to a nearby bar and goes up to her friend Kit and asks if all the money is gone. Kit answers she used some for her party, and Vivian replies she can't believe she took their rent money while she was sleeping and bought stuff with it. Meanwhile, Edward arrives in the city, asking a poor man how to get to Beverly Hills, and the man replies he's already there. Kit and Vivian are talking on the street when a man driving by asks for a freebie since it's his birthday, and Kit tells him to dream. Suddenly the two see a Lotus Esprit stopping, and Kit tells Vivian she should go for him and not take less than $100. She goes up to the window and asks if he wants a date, but he says he just wants directions to the Regent Beverly Wilshire Hotel. Vivian says she can help him for $10. First, he thinks she's ridiculous, then agrees. He only has a $20 bill, however, and Vivian insists to show him personally for that amount. As they begin to drive, she tells him he's forgotten to turn on the lights in the car. Edward asks for her name, and she playfully teases him, asking what he wants it to be, but then tells him it's Vivian. She starts asking about the car and comments that it must corner like it's on rails, but Edward doesn't know what that means, knowing nothing of cars. Suddenly he asks if she's ever driven a Lotus, which she hasn't, and Edward says she would do it right now. Vivian tells him to fasten his seatbelt and shows him what the car really can do. He asks how much money the girls earn these days, and Vivian says they can't take less than $100. Edward thinks she meant $100 a night, but she clarifies it's an hour. Edward comments that it's stiff, but Vivian playfully interprets what he said differently and starts touching him, responding no. But it has potential. They arrive and Vivian says she'll grab a cab back, and the two bid each other goodbye. Edward, however, walks back up to her saying he'd be very pleased if she could accompany him into the hotel. She gladly follows him and asks his name. He says Edward, and she jokes Edward is her favorite name in the whole world. They walk into the hotel, and Vivian gets his jacket since the hotel requires appropriate clothing. Edward orders some champagne and strawberries to the room. As they get to the elevator, Vivian behaves in a provocative manner, and a woman tells her husband to close his mouth. They get to the penthouse and she continues acting flirtatiously. She thinks the apartment is amazing, saying it has a fantastic view. Edward says he's scared of heights and never goes out there, but takes her word for it. Vivian asks what he would do with her now that she's there, and he responds that he doesn't know since he didn't plan this. She says he can pay her in the meantime to maybe break the ice, which he does. Vivian then picks out 7 colors and asks him to pick which one she wants. Edward says he just wants to talk a bit, and so they begin to talk. Suddenly the doorbell rings and Vivian runs to open it. The man has brought the champagne and strawberries, and Edward gives him a tip. Vivian asks if he has a wife or girlfriend, and Edward says he has both. She asks how that works, and Edward replies that his ex-wife lives with his ex-dog in his ex-home, and his ex-girlfriend Jessica is moving out as they speak. Vivian sees he's not drinking and asks if he will, and Edward replies he doesn't drink. She comments she likes his seductive scene but said she's on an hourly rate and asks if they can move it along. Edward senses her time problem is a major issue for her and asks how much for the whole night. Vivian says he can't afford it but he insists. She says $300, and Edward says deal. Soon after, Vivian fixes something in the bathroom, and Edwards walks in on her. She hides something, and Edward says he doesn't want illegal stuff in there. While she explains she doesn't do illegal stuff, he notices it's dental floss, and she explains it's for the strawberry seeds. Later, Edward is working on the phone as Vivian watches TV. She asks him to join her picnic, but Edward declines. Vivian soon after notices Edward is watching her intently, and she begins undressing for him. She gets close to him and asks what she wants, and Edward asks back what she does, and she replies she does everything, except kissing on the mouth, and Edward says he doesn't either. Next, Edward is taking a shower and soon after goes back into the bedroom and sees Vivian with her real hair. It's early morning, and Edward is on the phone with Philip, and they know that Mr. Morse is going to fight for his company. Edward then tells Philip he's car corners like it's on rails, and Philip, not knowing what it means, gets worried, and Edward hangs up. Edward offers Vivian breakfast, having ordered everything on the menu. She asks what he does, and he explains he buys companies that are in financial difficulty. She says that he must get them for a bargain price then, and Edward explains that he's buying one company right now for the bargain price of $1 billion. While she helps him tie his tie, she asks what he does after buying the companies, and he says he breaks them into pieces and sells the pieces for more than the whole. Not long after, Philip explains that Mr. Morse's grandson would join him for dinner, and says he should probably get someone to join him too. Suddenly Edward hears Vivian singing, and hangs up on Philip. He explains to Vivian that he has a business proposal to hire her to stay with him for a week. She replies that if it's 24 hours a day it's going to cost him. Edward asks how much, and Vivian says $4,000. Edward negotiates saying $2,000, and Vivian immediately counters with $3,000, and Edward says done. She gets totally ecstatic. Edward gives her some money, explains they would go out in the evenings, and wants her to buy something elegant to wear, not too sexy. As he has left, she screams with joy and happiness. She calls Kit and explains to her about Edward, and that she would get $3,000 in extra money for clothes, and Kit is super jealous. Vivian says she would leave some money for her in the reception and asks her to come by. Next, Vivian leaves a letter with money at the reception, and the hotel manager asks the receptionist if she's seen Vivian before. Vivian walks among some of the most expensive stores and feels on top of the world. She walks into a shop, but the retail workers told her the clothes won't fit her, and that they are too expensive for her. Vivian says she has money to spend, but then they tell her to get out of their store. She is dispirited and walks back to the hotel. As she gets back, the hotel manager stops her and asks her to follow him back to his office. Introducing himself as Mr. Thompson. He explains Edward is a very special customer, and they will overlook who he brings as a guest. He then asks who she is to Edward, and she answers that she is his niece. Mr. Thompson then asks if he will ever see her at the hotel again if Edward leaves, since surely she can't have other uncles at the hotel. She answers he won't, and the two have an understanding. As he tells her to dress more conservatively, Vivian tells him she's been trying to buy clothes but no one would help her. He lifts the phone and Vivian gets scared he will call the police, but then Thompson starts talking with a woman in a nearby boutique asking for a favor, and says he's sending over a very special guest. Next up, Vivian meets a woman who's called Bridget, who's very sweet and helps her. Meanwhile, in an office, Edward and his partner make a plan to buy Morse's company, after which Edward leaves. Philip asks about the woman who sang on the phone, but Edward says it's nobody he knows. Suddenly Vivian thanks Thompson in the lobby for helping him, saying he's cool. As she gets back to the room, the phone rings and it's Edward jokingly saying she should never pick up the phone. He tells her to meet him later in the lobby and they hang up. Edward calls back immediately and reminds her never to pick up the phone, and they laugh. Soon after she asks Thompson for help. He helps her learn dining ethics, but she's finding it a bit hard to remember what all the forks and knives are for. Later Edward returns to the hotel but doesn't see Vivian. Mr. Thompson appears telling him he has a message from his niece, that she's waiting for him in the lounge. Edward says they both know she's not his niece but thanks him. Edward first misses her but is surprised at how sophisticated she looks, saying she's stunning. They go to a fancy restaurant and meet Mr. Morse and his grandson David, and Edward introduces Vivian. Later, Vivian struggles with what fork to use, and Mr. Morse tells her he himself has never been able to figure out which goes with what. Later, Mr. Morse asks Edward what he intends to do with his company if he buys it, and Edward says he would break it up and sell it in pieces. David gets angry and respectfully wishes Vivian the best of luck and leaves. Mr. Morse himself wishes Vivian the best too and tells Edward he would tear him apart. Back at the hotel, Vivian thinks the business was good. Vivian comments she however thinks he likes Mr. Morse. Edward says it's irrelevant if he likes him, saying he tries to not get emotional in deals, and Vivian says she is the same, explaining that she's like a robot with a guy. She just does it, and which is why she doesn't kiss anyone. Edward says they are very similar, they both screw people for money. He says he would go downstairs for a while and leaves her. Later that night, Vivian calls room service and asks where Edward was, and she is led to him. Edward plays piano for the hotel employees and she's impressed hearing him. He then asks them all to leave them, which they did, and the two starts having an intimate moment together. Edward lifts her up on the piano, and they both start caressing each other. The following morning, Edward gives Vivian his credit card to buy clothes, and she says the stores weren't nice to her last time. Next, Edward follows her to the store to make sure they are nice to her and explains to the store owner they would spend an obscene amount of money in there. The store owner becomes euphoric and brings out several women who start helping Vivian. Suddenly, Edward gets a call from Philip, who says there's a problem, and Edward has to leave. Vivian continues testing clothes and is treated like a true queen, buying a lot of clothes. While shopping, she walks into the store that was mean to her last time, saying they made a big mistake, and leaves. She gets back to the hotel and Mr. Thompson gets happy seeing her. Vivian is really glowing. Meanwhile, Philip is happy because they found a way to buy Mr. Morse's company even though he doesn't want to sell it. Edward doesn't listen, and Philip asks what is wrong with him this week. Edward then tells Philip he loved to play with building blocks when young, remarking that they don't build anything in the company, they only destroy. That evening, Vivian has prepared a surprise for Edward, only wearing a tie, and next up Vivian gives Edward a therapy bath. The following day, they go to a polo game and Edward introduces her to two of his previous partners who have married other rich guys. They tell Vivian everyone is trying to land Edward, but Vivian replies she's not trying to land him but is using him to sleep with him, and leaves them stunned. Later, people remark on how sweet Vivian is, telling it to Edward. Edward and Vivian have fun together, and all the while Philip watches them. As Mr. Morse's grandson David, who is playing in the game, stumbles into Vivian later. Philip inquires about Vivian, thinking she's a spy Morse's sent. Trying to stop Philip from worrying, Edward explains that he picked her up on the street, and Philip starts laughing. While Edward goes to talk to his senator, Philip works up to Vivian, telling her he knows what she is and asks if they can get together when Edward leaves. As they get back to the hotel, Vivian is upset and becomes angry he told people who she was without informing her first so she could be prepared. Edward says he's sorry, but that Philip thought he was some industrial spy, and since Philip has been his attorney for 10 years, he thought he could trust him. She said no one has made him as cheap as he did today, and said she wants her money so she can get out of there. He picks up the money but she ignores it and leaves anyway, which Edward sees. As she waits for the elevator, Edward comes out saying he's sorry and that he wasn't prepared to answer questions about them, that it was stupid of him, and adds he doesn't want her to leave. As the elevator arrives, Vivian doesn't go in and then tells Edward that he hurt her and he shouldn't do it again, and the two go back inside. That night, Vivian tells him about her life and how she met Kit, who worked on the street, and made her do it as well. Explaining her life is not what she once dreamed it would be. Edward comments she is a very bright and special woman who could be so much more. The next day, Edward is leaving very early from work for a date, and Philip asks if it is with the street worker. Edward tells him never to call her that again. At the hotel, Edward tells Vivian she looks good but that something is missing, and shows her a necklace he's borrowed. After having asked, she's shocked it's $250,000. In the lobby, all the hotel personnel notes how beautiful she looks and are happy for her. The two go to an airport to take a private to San Francisco. They go to a fine opera and Vivian jokingly comments she sees a band on stage. Edward says people's first reaction to opera is dramatic, either they love it for the rest of their life or hate it. The overture starts and Vivian is excited. During the performance, Vivian gets captivated and very emotionally involved in the play. Afterward, she is absolutely filled with emotions and loves it. That night, Vivian asks Edward if he can skip work tomorrow to do things, and Edward remarks he does own the company. Next, Philip gets informed Edward is taking the day off and is baffled. Vivian and Edward have fun together the whole day, doing spontaneous things. That night, Edward has fallen asleep on the bed and Vivian slowly gets close to him and starts kissing him. He wakes up, and they both just continue, kissing each other passionately. The next morning, in their final day together, Edward tells her he's going back to New York but wants to see her again, and so he has arranged so that she gets her own apartment, a nice car, money to shop with, and other things. But then Vivian gets upset, telling him a story of how her mother locked her in the attic when she was young, and she had a dream of how a knight on a white horse will climb and save her from this trap tower. She then adds the knight never told her in that dream he would put her in a great apartment. Philip calls saying Mr. Morse wants to see him, and Edward says he's coming. Edward then tells Vivian he heard all she said but that he isn't capable of more right now. Later, Kit comes by, and as they meet, Kit comments that she was afraid to hug her since she might wrinkle her. Vivian tells Kit that Edward wants to see her again but that she doesn't want to. Kit doesn't believe her and thinks she's falling in love with him, and after some girly chatting, Vivian admits that she's in love. Meanwhile, Edward meets with Mr. Morse, who said that he's reconsidered his position but is concerned about all his employees. Philip starts saying that it would all be taken care of, but Edward stops him and tells everyone to get out so he can talk to Mr. Morse alone. Once alone, Edward says his interest in his company has changed, saying he doesn't want to sell his company off in pieces anymore but help him build it. Edward says they can leave the details for the others, and Mr. Morse is very happy and thanks him. As Philip gets in and Mr. Morse tells them all Edward and himself are going to build great ships together. Philip gets shocked. Edward takes a walk in the city, and a while later, Philip comes by Edward and Vivian's hotel room asking for Edward, who's not there. She says Edward who'd be back soon, and as Philip sits down beside her, he starts touching her, grabbing her, and as she fights back, he hits her. Vivian screams at him to get off her, and suddenly Edward appears. Philip starts calling Vivian a whore and Edward hits him real hard, yelling at him to get out. As he has helped Vivian later, she tells him he made her a really good offer but she wants more. Edward says the question is how much more, and Vivian says she wants the fairy tale. Edward gives her the $3,000, thanks her, and says if she ever needs anything, a dental flaw or whatever, he'll always answer her call. On her way out, Vivian thanks Mr. Thompson for everything and he says he hopes to see her again and gets a limousine for her. The following day, Vivian packed her belongings to go to San Francisco to get a job and finish high school, telling Kit she used to get pretty good grades. Her bus leaves in 1 hour and she gives Kit some of Edward's money, telling her to take care of herself. Edward is pondering as he is about to leave. In the lobby, Mr. Thompson gets a limousine for him. Edward asks if he can return the jewelry for him, and Thompson comments enigmatically it must be difficult to let go of something so beautiful, then adds Daryl, the limousine chauffeur, also drove Mrs. Vivian home yesterday, and Edward thanks him. Kit is seen talking to someone as Edward appears buying flowers. Suddenly, Vivian hears a car horn, and outside Edward arrives on a white limousine yelling Vivian's name. Edward then begins climbing the stairs up to her. While hugging her, he asks what happened after the night rescued her, and she replies she rescued him right back, and they start kissing. The movie ends here, and you're welcome to share your thoughts on this movie in the comment section below. Make sure to subscribe if you'd like to see more videos like this and hit the like button to help us out. I'll see you in the next video. Stay well, thanks. Welcome back to Movies Buff. Today I'll be going through a Nigerian drama, Mr. and Mrs. Savage. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. Make sure to subscribe to our channel, and press the bell icon so we'll bring you more interesting recaps like these. Mel has just been picked up from the airport. While she expresses her discomfort with the car she's been picked up in, she receives a call informing her that her mother has recently taken ill. Mel quickly makes a stop at a pharmacy to get some drugs. After getting what she needs, she steps out of the pharmacy but accidentally bumps into a stranger. She immediately signals that he must have been blind not to have seen her, and she proceeds to leave. After finding out that another car is blocking her from leaving, she scolds her driver and angrily steps back into the pharmacy. Mel meets the stranger, Bankole, to move his car out of the road, so she could leave, as she's in a hurry. Bankole tells her she lacks manners, which he blames on her upbringing, and insists she calls whomever she wishes to. Their heated exchange goes on for a while before Bankole finally opts out to leave. He arrives home and meets his wife, Kim, who's quite upset about his extreme work ethic. Kim reminds him of their anniversary the following day, and he assures her that he's got everything planned out. The following day, Bankole tells Kim he would be stepping out to quickly hand over some documents to Mrs. Darling, and he wouldn't fail to be back in time. Before leaving, Kim tells him that she's pregnant, and Bankole is overjoyed and shocked that they would finally be having a child after several years. Meanwhile, Mel has just recently taken over affairs at her parents' company. She instructs the HR manager to work on restructuring the organization by relieving unnecessary manpower and elevating the more industrious ones. Just as she finishes giving out her instructions, Bankole walks in and is shocked to see Mel. He soon deduces that she must be the daughter of Mrs. Darling. Mel asks what he's doing in her office, and just before he could answer, he receives a call from a delivery man meant to bring him a package. Bankole gives the delivery man Kim's phone number, which is also copied out by Mel. Mel calls Kim that Bankole is currently in her office at the moment flirting with her. Kim replies to Mel that whoever she has with her can't be her husband. Mel describes the native dress and perfume Bankole has on for Kim, and she proceeds to give her their current location. Kim immediately picks up a car to track them down. Shortly after, Bankole receives a call that Kim has been involved in a car crash. Mel returns home and explains to her mother that her day had been offset by the same man who had caused the incident at the pharmacy, and she feels that this man had her followed on purpose. Mrs. Darling suggests that she should have given the man a chance to explain why he was following her, as she is a very attractive woman, and he might have some interest in her. Mel blows off the idea, stating that she has no interest in such types of men. Then Mrs. Darling asks how her meeting with Bankole Badmus went. Mel is clueless as to who that might be, and Mrs. Darling explains that he is the MD of Stone Bank, and they were supposed to be having a meeting earlier that day. Mel replies that she never met anyone by that name. Just then Mrs. Darling receives a call from Bankole. After she apologizes for not being able to make it to the meeting, he informs her that he just lost his wife. A quick funeral is organized for Kim at their home. Mrs. Darling after the ceremony comes in to give her condolences. Mel, who is also there, becomes shocked to see that Bankole is the same man she felt had been stalking her. Mrs. Darling does a quick introduction, and Bankole calmly greets her and compliments her. Mel, who is still startled, offers her condolences as well, and she excuses herself. Later, Bankole goes to Mel's office and explains to her that he has now taken over as the new CEO of the company. Then he forces her and her employees out of the building. Mrs. Darling tries without any success to reach Bankole on the phone. Mel arrives home and seeks answers from her mother. Mrs. Darling gives Mel a letter which she reads and finds out their company owes the bank a lot of money. Mel decides to go see Bankole. He tells her he has been expecting her. Mel tells him to let her mother be, and he should come after her instead. Bankole tells her that she's of no value to him. He warns Mel that she and her mother have got 14 days to vacate their house, hence they would be thrown into the street. Mel abuses him and is about to leave when Bankole asks for her hand in marriage.
Marry me.
That is why I said!
Mrs. Darling is furious at the idea and unwilling to let Mel get married to Bankole not long after he lost his wife, just so she could get back the company. Mel discloses that she's already pregnant. This makes Mrs. Darling very surprised. After they get married, Bankole brings Mel back to his house. He tells her he expects her to adhere to the rules of his exquisite mansion, and she would be responsible for cleaning the house and preparing his meals. Mel counters that he must be a silly joker if he thinks she's going to be doing any chores. The following morning, Mel is dressed up and prepared to leave for work, but she gets to the door to find out it's been locked. She asks Bankole for the keys, and Bankole states that now she's a Badmus wife, whom are traditionally housewives, then she must be a sit-at-home wife. Mel is stunned by his words, and he tells her to go upstairs to change into something more appropriate, or not, and get comfortable with her new role by preparing him a local delicacy, which he fancies. Later Bankole comes up to her room and asks why his meal is taking so long. Mel counters that he can't possibly think he can make her into his toy. Bankole restates that she's his property now, and he'll do with her whatever pleases him. Mel tells him that he can't take her job from her. Bankole stresses that her only job is to take care of him and that if she should fail, her mother would lose her company, and both of them would be on the streets. Bankole is in a hurry to get to a meeting the next morning but finds out that the tires of all his cars have been deflated. While Bankole freaks out, Mel comes out and teases that he might as well take a cab or hop on a motorbike, as it would make quite the headline. She walks back into the house, and Bankole rushes to take a motorbike. Later, Bankole comes back home and is unable to get in the house because the doors have been shut. An agitated Bankole orders Mel to come downstairs and open the doors. Mel tells him he could go back to his office or check into a hotel, as a day without him in the house felt like heaven. Bankole asks his security to bring him a ladder, and he's ready to climb up when Mel picks up a bucket of water and pours it on him. Bankole threatens that she'll pay for what she's done. The following day, Mel is done having her bath and opens her wardrobe to find all her stuff gone. She rushes downstairs and asks Bankole what he had done with all of her stuff. He tells her to go check the gym house at the back of the house. She goes to check and finds all of her clothes caught up in flames. She goes back to him agitated and asks him to take her life already. He tells her he thinks her fashion taste is ridiculous, and that she would fit better in Kim's clothes. He tells her he also burnt all of her foreign hair and had all her bank cards blocked, as he had noticed her habit of ordering food, and if she must eat anything then she must cook. Later the drama continues between the couple when Bankole comes to the living room, changes the TV channel to his preferred choice, and he orders Mel to find some other room with a TV to watch what she wants. They both begin throwing spiteful comments at each other, which goes on for a while before an old friend of Bankole, Helena, arrives. She introduces herself to Mel as her teacher. Helena goes to meet Mel later, and she tells Mel that her husband had her enrolled in an attitude class. Mel asks Helena why she thinks she's qualified to be her teacher, as she believes she has a way better attitude than hers, and Mel demands her educational qualification. Helena tells Mel she should be honored to have her, as she's a master's holder in psychology from a prestigious university in New Zealand. Mel tells Helena to go find out who the best graduating student was in the year 2018, from the University of California. The following day, Mel is in the kitchen trying to prepare one of the local delicacies Bankole likes, but she has very little success and decides to give up. Later Mel approaches Helena, and she asks if she drank the oranges which she squeezed and kept in the fridge. Helena ignores Mel's questions. Mel tells her, she has no idea what she's still doing in her house, and it's about time she leaves. Mel tells her Bankole is her husband, and that she had better stay out of their business. Helena tells her that they live in Africa, and two is never a crowd. Later, we see Helena trying to seduce Bankole, to rekindle their old relationship before his marriage to Kim. Bankole responds that she's in his house for a single purpose, and that is to make Mel's life a living hell, and she shouldn't get distracted. Mel comes out and demands that Bankole kicks Helena out, as she's trespassing in her home. An argument soon ensues between the two ladies, resulting in Helena slapping Mel. Mel asks Bankole if he's just going to let his side piece humiliate her in such a manner. Bankole immediately withdraws and tells both ladies to sort themselves out. The next morning, Helena wakes Mel up by pouring water on her, and she instructs Mel to come downstairs and make breakfast. Shortly after, Mel receives a phone call from her mother, who seeks to know about her welfare. Mel responds that she's happy and that she's being treated right by Bankole. Mrs. Darling requests to speak with Bankole, but Mel tells her mom he's downstairs making her breakfast. Mrs. Darling wonders why they have no maids to do that. Mel responds that they both thought it wise to send away all the maids so they could be alone and bond better. Mrs. Darling tells her she can't wait till she's back at the office. Later, Bankole searches through his house for a lost item, but he finds a letter written by Kim to him. He reads through the letter, in which Kim expresses her gratitude for all he's done for her, and she wishes they both have a happy anniversary. Mel comes out and asks Bankole what is going on. Bankole, now overwhelmed with emotions, shouts at Mel that with just a single phone call, she destroyed his life. After scolding her, he steps out. Mel picks up the letter and reads it. For the first time, Mel feels guilty about what she had done. That night, Bankole returns home drunk. Mel tries to take care of him, but he shouts at her not to come close to him. While Bankole goes on lamenting over the death of Kim and blaming Mel for what his life has become, Helena comes downstairs and takes Bankole upstairs, to her bedroom. Mel is totally enraged by this. Meanwhile, Helena tries to take advantage of Bankole's unawareness and get intimate with him. Just then, Mel badges in on her and points a gun at her, asking for a reason not to blow her brains out. Mel chases Helena out of the house that night. The next morning, Bankole wakes up, and he's shocked to see Mel staring down at him with a smile. He asks why he was in Helena's room, why she was there beside him, and why he had no clothes on. Mel answers that it's not out of place to be naked in front of his wife. Bankole asks if they got intimate last night, and Mel tells him he wanted it badly, she just had to oblige. Then she tells him he was absolutely amazing, and she goes downstairs to make him breakfast. Mel is busy cleaning the house when she comes across a picture of Kim. She expresses her guilt for making the call that led Kim to an early grave and wishes she could take it all back. While she seeks forgiveness from Kim, Bankole walks in on her. He avoids being seen by her and leaves. Later he goes to Mel and asks what he perceives downstairs. Mel tells him she's trying to prepare him his favorite meal. He tells her he's not interested and she can take off the excitement she has on her face, as her plan of taking over his ex-wife's place after killing her would never happen. Mel reminds him that it was his idea they get married, to begin with. Bankole tells her she does not deserve happiness and she would never be happy. Mel seeks to know what else he wants from her, as she's only trying to fix things. Bankole asks if she's trying to fix the life she ruined by killing his ex-wife. Mel responds that he should kill her already and get it over with since he's got a gun. They go on at each other's throats spitefully for a while before Mel screams for it to stop, and she's tired and wants out. Bankole goes after her and tells her she's never leaving, as they would both die in the marriage together. They step out of the house and accidentally bump into Mrs. Darling, who just arrived. They greet her with a smile on their faces. Bankole asks Mel to take her mom's things upstairs, which she does. While having dinner, Mrs. Darling asks how they've been enjoying their marriage. Bankole tells her it's been fantastic and magical, and he goes on complimenting Mel, while she smiles back at him, playing along with his games. Although Mrs. Darling doesn't seem quite convinced. She asks about the baby they are both expecting. Mel comes up with an excuse that she had a miscarriage just 2 weeks into their marriage. Bankole steps in and suggests that they are both young, and there's no reason they wouldn't keep on trying. He promises Mrs. Darling at least 3 grandchildren. Bankole continues professing his love for Mel in front of her mother, who is heavily suspicious of their state of affairs. Mrs. Darling informs them of her plans to stay with them for some time, which they accept and promise her a wonderful reception. When she exits the dinner table, Bankole accuses Mel of setting all of this up, and he assures Mel of the worst when her mother leaves. Later that night, Mel goes to sleep in Bankole's room, knowing her mother would not believe their act earlier if they both slept in separate rooms. Bankole assures her that would not happen and tells her to find her way with resolving those issues with her mother. Mel enforces her way to the bed, and Bankole tries to drag her out of it, resulting in a brutal brawl between the couple. A loud argument ensues, and Mrs. Darling is woken up by this. While their arguments go on, Mrs. Darling walks into the room. She tells them she knew everything was wrong. She instructs her daughter to go pack her things, as they both leave immediately. Mrs. Darling assures Bankole that she would sign all necessary documents, handing over the company and estate back to him. The following day, Mrs. Darling scolds Mel for marrying a man who blames her for the death of his wife, knowing her condition. Mel assures her mom that she is okay, and the doctors confirmed it too. Mel explains that she married Bankole so they wouldn't lose everything. Mrs. Darling expresses that she means more to her than any company or estate. She advises Mel to go to Bankole and seek his forgiveness for the pain she caused him. Later, Mrs. Darling goes to Bankole. She expresses the admiration she's always had for him, considering how he took over a bank on the verge of collapse and turned it into one of the top banks in the country. She also tells him the story of how Mel developed her anger disorder. Her husband, Mel's father, had been unfaithful in their marriage. This then resulted in frequent quarrels, with several abusive and unkind words been thrown around the house, to which Mel was a constant witness. Mel was left vulnerable by this situation. Her vulnerability would eventually be taken advantage of by a servant at the house who abused her, and immediately stormed off. Mel, who from that day on grew angry and violent, was later diagnosed with intermittent explosive disorder. She was sent abroad to study and attend rehab. Mrs. Darling hands back the documents to Bankole and leaves. Later, Mel also comes to seek Bankole. She pleads for his forgiveness, and Bankole thanks her and leaves. Later, Bankole invites Mel to a restaurant. He plans on going away for some time to be able to rethink and heal over his wife's death. He tells Mel it was his wish to see her before he leaves, and tells her their issues are now bygones. He hands the company and estate documents back to Mel. Mel also returns the ring to Bankole, but he tells her to hold on to it, take some time to rethink, and he would accept any action she decides on. He promises her there would be no drama this time around, and the movie ends here. You're welcome to share your thoughts on this movie in the comment section below. Subscribe to my channel for more movie recaps like this one, and I'll see you in the next video. Stay well, thanks, welcome back. In today's video, we'll be going through the 2012 action thriller film, Jack Reacher. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. Make sure to subscribe to our channel, and press the bell icon so we'll bring you more interesting recaps like these. The movie begins, and in the opening scene, a man drives out to an empty building. He surveys a park not too far from his position, and soon he starts shooting at several targets who appear to be random, killing most. Later, a couple of armed policemen storm the building in search of the shooter. Emerson, the detective lead on the case, goes through the crime scene. He finds a bullet and a quarter at the scene. They run an analysis of the evidence, and the fingerprint of a man named James Barr comes up. Barr is found in his home and arrested with compelling evidence, linking him to the shooter, found in his home. Barr is interrogated at the station by Emerson and the DA, Roldan. Emerson commences by threatening Barr that he's likely going to face the death penalty, which the DA prefers, but he wishes to see Barr live a long life in prison. Emerson then tells Barr Roldan feels generous today and is willing to let him take a pic if he confesses to the murder of the victims at the park and waives his right to counsel, saving himself and the city a costly trial. Barr takes the paper to sign the deal. Roldan celebrates their quick victory, but they are shocked when Barr inscribes on the paper the words, "Get Jack Reacher." The police immediately begin digging, finding clues as to who Jack Reacher might be. They could only find clues of who he was before he disappeared. Emerson briefs Roldan that Reacher was born and raised in the military on bases abroad. Reacher was a distinct military personnel who served the U.S. military in several countries, earning multiple medals and attaining the status of major. Reacher also spent the bulk of his service as a police in the military. While they keep talking, Reacher walks into Roldan's office. Reacher is taken to see Barr. Roldan asks Reacher why he was mentioned as a witness by Barr. Reacher, doubtful, asks for proof, which Roldan refuses. Reacher leaves abruptly. While they try to stop him from leaving, Barr's attorney, Helen, shows up. She's upset that Roldan and Emerson might have been speaking to her client without her presence. Reacher is surprised. She's Barr's attorney, and Emerson introduces her as Helen Roldan, the district attorney's daughter, which makes him even more surprised. Reacher inquires if it's even legal for Helen to go up against her father in court, to which she replies fortunately it is. While Helen tries to depose Reacher, stating that he's her only defense witness, thinking Reacher is friends with Barr. He clarifies that he and Barr aren't friends, and in fact, the only reason he's here is to bury Barr. Helen interviews Reacher further over coffee. She tells Reacher that her father has never lost a capital case because he never picks a fight he can't win. Every murder suspect is given one of two options, either to confess or face the death penalty, against a DA that never loses. Helen strongly believes that more than one innocent man has been put down without a fight. Reacher responds she's fighting on the wrong side this time, as he has no doubts that Barr is guilty. Reacher then tells Helen a little history about Barr. He tells her Barr joined the military because he was the kind of man who wanted a legal means of killing. Barr made sniper and he trained hard, firing about 2,000 rounds each week. Barr had been taught to visualize the base of a man's skull with every shot. Finally, he gets deployed to Iraq, and for 2 long years, he is kept on overwatch, never once firing a single shot. The war ends, and Barr finds himself unable to scratch the itch of not for once firing at a human target. The day before he leaves, he takes his gun and kills 4 civilian contractors who had been hired by the military. Although he covered his tracks well, he got caught by Reacher and confessed. Helen asks why he wasn't imprisoned then. Reacher explains that the 4 men had just recently been on a rape rally of 28 women, and someone within the corporation wanted everything swept under the rug. Helen deduces that he was about to hand all this information to the DA. Reacher tells her that the last time he saw Barr, he made him a promise which he came over to keep, but realized he doesn't need to, after seeing him in the condition he was. Helen tells Reacher that Barr might get away this time also, as he was injured in state custody, and she's going to declare him unfit to stand trial. Helen asks Reacher to be her lead investigator and look through the evidence objectively. Reacher agrees, but on the condition that she also looks into the victims objectively. Helen visits Mr. Fourier, the father of one of the victims. She tells him she's hoping to get a better sense of the victims. He asks if she's spoken with the other families, and she confirms that she has spoken to those who would speak to her. Then he lets her in. Meanwhile, Reacher is at the crime scene, and after some observations, he notices something quite unusual. But what does he notice? We'll find out in a bit. Mr. Fourier hands Helen an article telling her everything she wishes to know about his daughter is in there. Helen becomes scared after seeing a gun on the table and tries to leave. He stops her, asking why she would defend a man who took everything from him. Helen, realizing she's made a mistake coming to his house, apologizes and leaves immediately. While she's about to drive away, she's accosted unexpectedly by her father. He asks if it's true she's been talking to the victims' families by herself. She asks him how he knew and how he found her. He replies that she isn't the only one with the right investigators and warns that Reacher can't be trusted, as she knows very little about him. Roldan pleads with his daughter not to make a terrible mistake by choosing to fight him on this case, as she might ruin her career all in a bid to hurt him. This vexes Helen, and she leaves abruptly. Reacher also takes a look at the evidence gathered by the police at the station. Emerson assures him he's free to come back to take a look anytime he wants. Reacher responds that he doesn't need a second look. Emerson, shocked, states that he didn't take any notes. Reacher also responds that he doesn't need to. Emerson asks Reacher about his job as a cop in the Army. Reacher replies that it's pretty much the same as his, except every suspect was a trained killer. Before leaving, Reacher ponders over why Barr might have paid for packing, considering that he was about to kill 6 people, but was worried about the meter maid. Emerson answers that it might have been out of habit and muscle memory, and probably didn't know he was doing it. Emerson asks what the serial number was on the riffle, and Reacher responds by asking what the date on the quarter was. After telling Emerson it was 1968, he leaves. Reacher then walks into a crowded bar, and he's soon approached by a young lady. She tells him her name is Sandy, He tells her he was also Sandy, last week, on a beach in Florida. She asks for his name, and he tells her
Jimmy Reese.
Not expecting that, she tells him he doesn't look like a Jimmy. After a little cheat chat, she asks if he wishes to leave the bar for a more quiet place like her car. Reacher asks her if she's old enough to drive, and she tells him she's old enough to do a lot of things. Reacher tells her he won't be able to afford her. Sandy, shocked, immediately claims that she's not a hooker, and she works at the auto parts store. Reacher explains to her that the cheapest women always tend to be the ones you pay for. This vexes Sandy, and she stands up annoyed, yelling that she isn't a hooker. This attracts the attention of a gang of young men who in turn claim Sandy is their sister. Sandy claims that she was called a whore by Reacher. Reacher explains that nobody said whore, telling them she inferred the word hooker, but he meant slut. The leader of the gang asks Reacher to step outside, as he was going to beat his ass, and it would be his choice if that were to happen in the bar or outside. Reacher agrees to step out. When they all walk outside, Reacher warns that this is their final chance to walk away, but they ignore his warning, stating that he's outnumbered. A fight ensues, and Reacher takes out the leader with a few moves, before fending off the rest of the gang. Soon the police arrive, and they run away, leaving Reacher, who's asked to go to the ground. Reacher now realizes he has been set up. Reacher is arrested, and Helen comes to the station with Emerson to bail him out. Emerson tells Reacher he's starting to understand why he moves around a lot. He leaves and Helen scolds Reacher. Helen tells him that whatever he does while working as her investigator is a reflection of her and her firm. Reacher apologizes and explains that a girl came onto him and picked a fight. He tells Helen that the girl knew who he was, and the cops rolled in before the fight even started with her brothers, making him believe someone had set the whole thing up. He asks Helen about her day, and she tells him it went exactly the way she thinks he hoped it would. Then he asks her what she's learned. Helen gives Reacher the details of each of the victims, starting with Chrissy Fourier, who was 22 and a nanny, caring for the 6-year-old daughter of family friends. She had planned on leaving for China the week before, but the 6-year-old girl she cared for wanted Chrissy to stay for her 7th birthday, and both were en route to pick out a dress that day. Rita Coronado was a cleaning lady at a plaza who had a 9-year-old son she dropped off at school each day before work. Rita was on her way to pick up tickets for her son's first baseball game that day. Nancy Holt had told her husband she was taking her car to be serviced that day, but instead she was headed downtown. Line Archer was on her way to secure a loan to save her late husband's construction business she had always hated, because she could not bring herself to sell the company. Darren Sawyer was an investment broker in the same building Rita worked. His wife said they'd grown increasingly distant, and their last words to each other weren't kind. His body was found next to a bouquet of roses he bought on his way to work. Reacher tells Helen that about 2.5 million Americans die every year, and 5 of them dying on the same spot on a single day doesn't seem quite random to him.
I'm sorry, could you please put a shirt on?
This is my shirt.
Reacher comes up with a claim that Darren and Nancy might have been in an affair, and that is probably why Nancy kept walking whilst everyone ran. Helen asks what his point was, and he tells her that 2 of the victims might have not been there by chance. Reacher asks Helen to help him get Barr's credit card statement, as he would require a list of all the places he hung out. Helen asks what he was hoping to find, but he tells her he needs some sleep. He picks up her keys and gives them to her, then he tells her to come pick him up the next morning at 7. Later that night a man who had been following Reacher drives to meet Charlie and the Zek. He gives them information on Helen and Reacher. He tells them he suspects Reacher might know something, so he took steps, but it ended up blowing back on him. Charlie grows upset, telling him he was out of place making such decisions, as they have a process of doing things that they stay done. The Zek comes out of the shadows and the man is terrified. He pleads for an opportunity to fix his mistakes. The Zek tells him that he has no chance of fixing anything, but he would have use of him if he could show he was rare and willing to do anything to survive. He's asked to chop off his fingers with his teeth. Unable to meet the Zek's demand, he gets shot in the head. The next morning, Helen gives Reacher Barr's credit card statement and witness testimonies. She tells him Barr's CC statement was a dead end as all he bought was gas and groceries. Reacher asks her to help him find gun ranges of 100 miles to 150 miles from their location. Helen wants to know why, and Reacher points out that Barr consistently filled his tank and took long drives on the weekends. Reacher asks Helen to drop him off at the auto parts store, which she does. He walks into the store, sees Gary the store manager, and requests to see Sandy. Gary asks to see some ID, and Reacher tells him he would be seeing the inside of an ambulance instead if he tries to stop him. Now speaking with Sandy, Reacher asks where he could find Jeb. After giving Reacher his address, she asks if she's in trouble. Reacher shakes his head and asks for her car keys. Before he leaves, she tells him that she gets off work by 6. Reacher advises that she seems sweet, pretty, and smart. He tells her she doesn't have to let herself be used by the guys she finds herself with. She replies that it's just what girls like herself do. Reacher also advises her to leave town. Then he goes to Jeb's house. He meets an old lady at the door who says nothing to him, then he enters, and searches the house. While still in Jeb's house, Reacher is attacked by 2 men who are very enthusiastic to get their hands on him. Although caught in a tight position, he manages to fend off the men and finally put them down. Then a third guy, Punk, walks up behind him pointing a gun at his head. Reacher defends himself by seizing the gun. He asks Punk for the whereabouts of Jeb, and he replies that the last they spoke Jeb had told him he was going to meet up with a guy. Reacher takes his keys and leaves. Reacher goes to Helen's office. In there he informs her that Jeb, the guy from the bar, is dead. Helen asked Reacher how hard he hit him, and he explains that he wasn't the cause. Jeb was murdered and someone tried to make it look as though he left town. Reacher then tells Helen that 99% of the evidence her dad has did not exist in Baghdad, not because Barr was smart, but because he was trained. Reacher explains that from the garage, the shooter had the sun in his eyes, with targets moving left and right, making it difficult conditions for any sniper. Reacher assumes that with the training Barr had, Barr would have taken the shots instead from the bridge, which would have given him more ideal conditions. Helen asks what Reacher was getting at, and he tells her he believes Barr is innocent, as Barr was incapable of firing 6 perfect shots in such poor conditions. Helen accuses Reacher of stringing up theories, as she believes he doesn't want this case closed, as it might be his last. She tells him her father was right, and how it all makes sense now. Reacher then shows her the car which has been following him all day. He gives her the tag number, asking her to run a search on it. At the same time, the Zek receives a call, and he later informs his men that their cover has been blown. Meanwhile, Helen receives information that the number is registered to a company called Lebendauer Enterprises. They discover that the conspiracy had been to kill 4 random people to hide one specific target. Someone needed O-line Archer's construction business, and she wasn't willing to let it go. Helen tells Reacher that it's just a theory. Reacher assumes that whoever framed Barr knew about Baghdad, and the only person who could have given that information was Barr himself. Reacher tells her to help him find any close associates of Barr, as that would lead them closer to finding the killer. Helen argues that finding the shooter isn't her job, and even if she believes Barr is innocent, she's unwilling to take any of this to court. Reacher thanks her for the coffee and leaves. Sandy is getting ready to leave town when she comes across Charlie. He introduces himself as a friend of Jeb's and tells her she must have been pretty wasted during their previous meeting, not to remember him. Charlie tells her she looks great, and if she would mind grabbing a drink with him tonight. She tells him she's meeting some people and opts to leave when she's knocked out by another of the Zek's thugs. The next morning, Helen goes to meet Reacher, and she gives him the location of a gun range that matches his requirements. She tells him to rest as he has a long drive the next day. Reacher warns Helen that 4 random people were killed to cover up the murder of O-line, and if he's right, just saying her name could get her killed. Reacher warns her to be careful. Emerson and the police find Sandy's body in a dumpster close to her apartment. Reacher arrives at her apartment and finds the police taking out Sandy's body in an ambulance. Emerson sights Reacher, and after staring at him for a while, he angrily begins a chase. In pursuit, Emerson calls for backup and air support. Although being considered the suspect, Reacher also chases after Charlie on a highway bridge. They get separated by a tunnel for a while, but Reacher bumps into a row of roadside water containers at the tunnel end. His engine fails to reignite for some time, but his car starts after much effort. The chase continues and Reacher keeps going after the Zek's men, but they manage to evade him when he gets blocked by the cops. Now, to save himself from the raging cop cars and helicopters, he sees an oncoming bus, and he steps out of his slowly moving car to join the passengers waiting to board the bus. They provide him with cover until the bus arrives, and Reacher successfully evades the cops. DA Roldan tells Helen a warrant has been issued for Reacher's arrest, as they have got a strong reason to believe Reacher was responsible for the death of Sandy. Helen refuses to believe the accusations that her dad and Emerson tell her about Reacher. An argument soon ensues between Helen and her dad. She tells them she has no idea where Reacher might be after he left her office that morning. Helen gets a call from Reacher, and he tells her he's being framed just like Barr, and Sandy was killed because they want him to run, but he won't. He tells her he thinks either Emerson or her dad has some affiliation with the bad guys, as he's been followed from day one, and only she and both of them knew he was in town. Reacher visits the gun range, and he meets Mr. Cash, the owner. He tells Mr. Cash he's looking for a friend who served with him in Iraq. Mr. Cash asks if his friend has a name, and he responds James Barr. Mr. Cash tells him he's never heard of anyone with that name before. Reacher then explains that he's not a cop, and he's only here because he believes Barr is innocent. Mr. Cash gives Reacher 3 bullets, and asks him to hit the target with all of them, and maybe then they can talk. Reacher takes a shot. Mr. Cash is impressed and he tells him he would answer one question. Reacher asks who his best shooter was, and he replies that Barr was his best shooter. Mr. Cash hands Reacher all of Barr's targets, and Reacher claims that Barr isn't as good, even on his best day in the army. Reacher tells him it's possible Barr had a friend who he let switch the targets on the range. Reacher asked if Barr came alone, and Mr. Cash shows him the footage of Barr and his associate coming into the gun range. Through the footage, they can see Charlie's face. Meanwhile, Helen discloses to her father all the dirt she could dig up on Lebendauer Enterprises. Roldan doesn't buy into any of it, and he tells her she's beginning to sound delusional. Helen tells him that all of this information was pulled out under her name, and if what Reacher said was true, then her life is in danger, and whatever happens to her would be on his head. Roldan assumes she's testing him, and he tells her she might find it hard to believe, but he does love her, and if she believes she's in danger, then the next thing to do would be to put her in protective custody. Helen refuses and leaves. When she gets into the elevator, Emerson also rushes to catch up with her. While there, she realizes Emerson might be the mole and tries to escape, but he tases her. Then she's kidnapped by the Zek's men. Reacher calls Helen, but Charlie picks up and tells him he has her, and if he doesn't show up in the next hour, he's going to hurt her. Reacher tells him he doesn't care about Helen, and he has his picture which he's taking to the feds, then he hangs up. After a moment, he calls back and tells Charlie he wishes to kill him, and when Charlie tries to enforce he was going to kill Helen, Reacher hangs up again. Then he calls back again. This time he tells Charlie that he's no hero, and he's got nothing to lose, and if he does hurt Helen he would beat him to death and drink his blood. Reacher asks for their location, and tells Charlie if he as much as thinks Helen has been hurt, he would disappear, and if he's smart that should scare him. Charlie gives him the location, and they get their ambush ready for Reacher. Cash meets up with Reacher, and hands him a knife. Reacher thinks he's joking, and restates how serious the situation was. Cash tells him he's aware and that's why he showed up, but he's unwilling to let him kill someone with his gun. They both plan out their strategy to get into the base as Cash would provide him cover, but Reacher is worried if his shooting skills are still competent enough. Meanwhile inside the base, Helen asks the Zek if the money he's making is enough to justify killing all those people. The Zek tells her there is no such thing as justification, as they take what can be taken. She turns to Emerson and asks why he did it. Emerson replies that she makes it sound like he had a choice. Reacher calls again to know if Helen is okay, and she tells him that they are ready for him. She pleads with him not to put his life in danger for her. He tells her to hang on and to say she believes is coming to get her. Which she does. Reacher drives in reverse in a padded vehicle into the base while coming under heavy fire. Eventually, the vehicle gets stuck, and while Cash provides him with some cover he manages to get out. Reacher, defenseless at this point, hides behind some rocks. Soon he manages to take out one of the men shooting at him. He takes his gun and takes out the other. Charlie goes to the main room to send out more reinforcement, but the two men are easily taken out by Reacher. Charlie advises the Zek to leave, before stepping outside to search for Reacher. He steps out and discovers that every single one of his men has been taken out by Reacher. Soon he gets caught off guard and disarmed by Reacher. Reacher, desiring a fist fight instead, puts his gun down, and soon a tough battle ensues between both men. While both men show great stamina, Reacher gains the upper hand and breaks Charlie's leg. This makes him pull out a knife, and he attacks Reacher ferociously. Reacher manages to defend himself, and he knocks his opponent out. Emerson, now scared, uses Helen as a body shield, but Reacher pulls out a perfect shot, killing him. Helen is greatly relieved to see Reacher. Reacher meets the Zek for the first time. While Helen tries to contact the police, Reacher tells the Zek that he would feel right at home in prison. The Zek replies that prison in America would be a retirement home, if he goes there at all. Reacher, convinced the system would not deliver justice, points a gun to the Zek, and pulls the trigger. Helen asks him what about bringing the bad guys to justice, and Reacher explains that he just did. Reacher says his final goodbye to Helen, and Helen, not wishing to see him leave, asks how she would be able to find him if she needs him. Reacher replies that she'll do fine, and she doesn't need him anymore. Helen goes to see Barr, and Barr tells her he has no wish to fight the case. He confesses to her that he's done bad things before and got away with it. Helen promises that he would be okay, but he refuses to believe her. He tells her no one can protect him from Reacher. Then we see Reacher leaving on a bus, and the movie ends here. You're welcome to share your thoughts on this movie in the comment section below. Subscribe to my channel for more movie recaps like this one, and I'll see you in the next video. Stay well, thanks.